My recent review of this Ryzen 9 7950X3D was generally very favourable. I gave it 9 out of 10 and a must-have award. However, I finished my review by saying another of my cons is that we haven't been able to compare the Ryzen 9 7950X3D to the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. And that makes me skeptical because I suspect that Zen 4 Ryzen 7 3D is going to be blooming good for gaming. So for the moment, I'm going to say hold your horses. And I was not alone in that sentiment. Something similar was said by Steve from Hardware Unboxed.
So there you have it, the Ryzen 9 7950X3D. It's an impressive CPU that does a good job of combining strong productivity performance with class-leading gaming performance. But the 700X3D will still generally be the faster processor.
And also by the great man himself, Linus.
So I suspect that most people would be better off with the regular or X variants of the 7950 and 7900, or better off waiting for the 7800X3D.
And now the time has come for my review of the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D.
Iron Wolf Pro. Tough, ready, scalable.
AMD's embargo on the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is rather strict. Ahead of the due date, we're not allowed to do an unboxing and we're not allowed to tell you that we have the processor for review. So I can't do one of those "we've got a review coming soon" kind of videos. Not allowed. In a sense, however, I'm rather glad of that because the unboxing would not have taken very long. Let's have a look, shall we? That's it. We're done. No cooler to show you. It's just a processor and a sticker and a leaflet. We need to look at the specification and then we need to see how it behaves and how it performs. It's an 8-core processor with 16 threads, maximum boost speed 5 GHz, which is relatively lowly, 120 watts TDP, and a mighty 104 megabytes of cache because of the slab of 3D V cache. AMD gives us a chart comparing their new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D with Intel's Core i9-13900K. At one end of the scale, they're claiming significant gains. At the other end of the scale, some minor losses. The next chart compares the new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D with the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D that we reviewed a few weeks ago. And here we can see, for example, in Far Cry 6, the new Ryzen 7 is claimed to have a 13% win over the Ryzen 9. At the other end of the scale, Cyberpunk 2077, we got an 8% loss. So a reasonable spread of performance, but it's suggesting that in the main, the two processors will be inseparable. And then we look at how the three Zen 4 3D processors compare in terms of cores, threads, TDP and pricing. The 16-core Ryzen 9 7950X 3D, expensive at $699. Here in the UK with the taxes that comes out to £749. Then we have the Ryzen 9 7900X 3D, 12 cores, 6 with extra cache, 6 with regular cache, priced at $599 and offering a relatively modest discount over the 7950X 3D. And then we have the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, $449, we estimate £479 here in the UK with VAT. The current crop of 3D processors do allow you to tickle the settings somewhat. You can use Curve Optimizer and Performance Boost Overdrive, where the Zen 3 3D Ryzen 7 was pretty much locked to stock settings. The curious thing with the next comparison is that all three processors have a TDP of 120 watts, and yet the clock speeds of the 16-core processor and the 12-core processor are far higher on paper than the Ryzen 7. And then we see AMD's extensive product stack with processors on both the AM4 and AM5 platforms. If you look in the right hand column on this chart, you can see the competing Intel processors. At the bottom of the stack, the Core i5 non-K version, and right up the top, Core i9 13900KS. To test the new Ryzen 7 processor, I have 3 test platforms. I have this MSI MPG Z790 carbon Wi-Fi motherboard that I reviewed just recently for Kit Guru, along with Core i9, Core i7 and Core i5 K-SKU processors. Refer back to my review of the MSI and you'll see I was using manual voltage settings to keep the power under control because this motherboard was overpowering the CPUs on auto. So I've got the data from this motherboard review with these 3 CPUs. Then I have this Gigabyte B550 Aorus Master, which is an AM4 board, and I'm using that with the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, i.e. Zen 3 3D processor, using that with some Corsair Vengeance DDR4 memory. We've got a bunch of common components. Power supply, Seasonic Vertex GX1200, so that's gold rated, ATX3. I have a stack of Sabrent Rocket 4.0 SSDs, each with fresh installations, depending on whether it's AM4, AM5, 3D, non-3D. I've got a couple more SSDs actually in these different boards. We have some G.Skill Trident Z RGB DDR5 6000 memory. I use that in both the Intel platform and also the AM5 platform. The motherboard for the AM5 platform is this Asus ROG Crosshair X670E Hero, which I used when I benchmarked the Ryzen 9 7950X3D and the Ryzen 9 7950X. I've also recently tested this Ryzen 7 7700X, which is the closest that we have as a non-3D of the 7800X 3D. If you're keeping tabs, that's 4 AM5 processors, 1 AM4 processor, and 3 LGA 1700. 8 processors in total, all tested with this Gigabyte GeForce RTX 4080 gaming OC graphics card. The cooler in all cases, this Corsair H150i Elite LCD. I have to say, having these snap-in, snap-out brackets, you can switch it from AM4 to AM5 to LGA 1700. Absolute godsend. My first run in Cinebench R23 appeared to throw up a problem. While the clock speed matched the specification quite accurately, the power draw looked on the low side, 95 watts against a TDP of 120 watts. If anything, we expect the power draw to be above the TDP. That's just the way of the world. AMD had told us to expect a Cinebench score of around 18,200. So when the score came in at 17,500, we appeared to have a problem. Following AMD's tech advice, we first reset the memory so it's running at default, i.e. 4800 mega transfers rather than 6000 mega transfers. And the most curious thing here is the effect it had on CPU power draw, losing over 10 watts from the package power draw. This did not affect the clock speed of the processor, and while the Cinebench score improved, it was by a tiny amount. Following more tech advice from AMD, we rolled back the BIOS. We had installed the latest version available on the Asus website, so we rolled back to a version that had been verified by AMD. Resetting the memory to 6000 mega transfers, we saw no change. Power draw still 95 watts, clock speed perfectly okay, Cinebench score did not hit the expected mark. We ran Cinebench a number of times and we got repeated figures, all about 3% below AMD's spec. So it looks like our processor simply is not particularly good. And so we turn to our performance charts and we see how the combination of 8 cores, 16 threads, relatively low clock speeds and loads of cache works in practice. In Cinebench R23 multi-core, the new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D beats the previous Ryzen 7 5800X 3D by a healthy margin, but it loses to the other CPUs in our chart. Power consumption, a mere 93 watts. Even the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D pulls 115 watts. And then the other CPUs go up from 145 all the way to 260 watts. The new CPU uses very little power. Arguably, it doesn't use quite enough power. Is AMD leaving performance on the table, we have to wonder. CPU temperature in Cinebench R23, All of these processors using the same Corsair 360mm AIO. The new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, a mere 77 degrees Celsius. In fairness to the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, that's even cooler. Cinebench R23 single core. Just look at the step up from the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D to the new 7800X 3D. That is a significant percentage increase. And then the gap closes down as we go up through the chart. However, the new Ryzen 7 isn't especially fast. Blender Classroom is another straight CPU test, so the 7800X 3D is relatively slow, but it is a lot faster than the previous 5800X 3D. 7-zip benchmark, another test of grunt. Once again, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is towards the foot of the chart. ADA 64 memory bandwidth. The Ryzen 7 5800X 3D at the foot of the chart is running on DDR4. It is way down the chart for that reason. All the other processors are using the same G.Skill DDR5 6000, and the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is the bottom of the group of 7, albeit by a small margin over the Ryzen 7 7700X. And then the other processors stretch away, Intel topping the chart. 3D Mark CPU profile, a synthetic CPU test. Once again, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D at the bottom of the chart, and then the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D just above. And then we move on to gaming, where things definitely swing in the favour of the 3D cache processors. In Borderlands 3 at 1440p, the new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D leaps to the top of the chart with an average of 173 FPS. This is only 1 FPS ahead of the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D, but a win's a win. It is worth taking note, however, the 1% low is 109 FPS, which is obviously no problem whatsoever, but that is significantly lower than the Ryzen 9 3D at 131 FPS and the Core i9 13900K at 130 FPS. If we compare the new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D with the previous Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, it's a win, but the difference is not huge. Borderlands 3 at 1080p. Once again, the 7800X 3D is at the top of the chart, beating the 7950X 3D by a handful of frames. Again, there's a big gap between the average and the 1% low, but the 1% low is very healthy. And if we look in third place, we see the previous Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Interesting to see the step up from Zen 3 to Zen 4 Ryzen 7 3D. It's a healthy gain, but once again, not huge. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy at 1440. The Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is at the top of the chart. Spoiler alert, you're going to get bored hearing that. Again, there's a big gap between the average and the 1% low, but you have to go a significant way down the chart this time to find the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy at 1080. Up at the top of the chart, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Just one frame behind it on average, Ryzen 9 7950X 3D. It's clear those processors are using a single core complex to game on, so a Ryzen 7 does a decent job. Far Cry 6 at 1440. Here we see the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D starting to stretch its legs. The average is an enormous 186 FPS, the 1% low, a very respectable 122 FPS. In second place we have the Core i9, and a very short head behind that, the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D. And if we compare the new Ryzen 7 3D to the previous Zen 3 Ryzen 7 3D, it's about a 20% differential. Far Cry 6 at 1080. Holy moly, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is at the top of the chart with 197 FPS. That is just huge. In second place, the Ryzen 9 3D, 175 FPS. Both processors doing 124 FPS at 1% low. That's a solid win for the new Ryzen 7 without a shadow of a doubt. Hitman 3 at 1440. We've got the new Ryzen 7 7800X 3D at 221 FPS on average and 97% 1% low. Behind that, the Ryzen 9 3D and then the Core i9. Hitman 3 at 1080. Again at the top of the chart, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, followed by the Ryzen 9 and then the Core i9. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, 315 FPS with a 1% low of 179. Behind that we have the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D losing by a relatively small margin considering the enormous number of frames we're talking about here. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p. At the top, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D at 319 FPS. Behind that, the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D at 304. And then in third place, Ryzen 7 5800X 3D with a healthy 289 FPS. Watch Dogs Legion at 1440. This is where things close up, but the win still goes to Ryzen 7 7800X 3D at 148 FPS with the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D at 147 FPS. Only 1 frame per second difference, and if you look you'll see the 1% lows go in the favour once again of the Ryzen 9. Watch Dogs Legion at 1080. This is a clear win for the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. It beats everything, both in average and also 1% low. If you skip through some of those charts, then I can't blame you. In the pure CPU tests, this processor does perfectly okay, but it struggles against the Core i9 and the Ryzen 9. No great surprise there. On the other hand, in gaming tests, it just wins everything. And really, how often do you need to hear that? Win, 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 win. Unless, of course, you're AMD. But you've now seen the evidence, and holy moly, it's good. So, pros and cons. Pros, the good points. Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is impressively efficient. Less than 100 watts for the CPU. And as you saw, if you disable the equivalent of XMP and you turn the memory down to default, I mean, it's only just over 80 watts, which is so stunning, the work that this processor can do on so little power. The second pro, Zen 4 with 3D cache delivers huge gaming performance. So the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D, the 16 core, wow, that's good. And now the 8 core also. I think of the 16 core as being this processor plus another 8 cores. It's perfectly possible that the Ryzen 9 7900X 3D, the 12 core, which is 6 plus 6, that might be doing something different because games might want 7 or 8 cores. So until we test that processor, not certain about that one. But this, oh yes, it's good. And the third pro, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, doesn't require fancy chipset drivers to deliver the performance. Unlike the 16 core, where I seem to spend half of my review telling you how you have to install and set up the software. Blimey, that was the thing. This is quite straightforward. It just works. Cons, the negative points. So the first one is the price looks quite steep. You saw in that comparison chart that AMD thinks this processor goes up against the Core i7-13700K. In terms of pricing, that would have been true a short while ago, but now you can buy the Core i7 for £410. Now, of course, the processor is only part of the cost of your PC, but this processor is expensive. In fact, as a broader point, I'm not even sure this is a 7800X. It's obviously a 3D, no argument there. But the TDP and the clock speeds, to my mind, make this a sub Ryzen 7 7700X. It's 7600 or 7650. To my mind, the numbering is wrong. I think AMD crowbarred in the Ryzen 7 7700 at one price point and one spec to put a product in that stack, and then they put this 3D in above it, I think, so they can increase the price. So the processor's good, but where it sits in the stack and what it's called, not so sure about that. Secondly, the 95 watt power draw seems artificially low. So it's a 120 watt TDP. How many processors have we seen in recent times that run at less than TDP? I mean, none is the short answer. So the TDP is incorrect. Now, that's not a problem as such. AMD could have called this a 95 watt processor, and I'd have said, sure thing. But it all seems to me to lead back to this thing, which is, what is this part? Is it really a Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, or is it a something else? Finally, you'll need to budget for an AM5 motherboard and DDR5 RAM. This Crosshair Hero board here sells for £660, which is just monumental. On the other hand, you can get budget B650 boards for 200 and upwards pounds. There's quite a lot of boards at that price. You also need some DDR5 memory, which will set you back £125 for 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000. So depending on which motherboard you choose, your platform is either going to be horribly expensive or actually not too bad. Now, we tested the 16-core Ryzen 9 7950X3D on the Hero because when that processor was delivered to us, there were only 4 boards, one each from Asus, ASRock, MSI, Gigabyte, and you needed a supporting BIOS. So we didn't have much choice in the matter. It's not crystal clear to me that the motherboard manufacturers have released new BIOSes to support the 3D processors yet. So it is not inevitable that if you take your motherboard, update the BIOS, and then plop in the 16-core 3D, that it's going to work correctly. So were we to test that processor, those processors on one platform, and then test this on a completely different motherboard, well, we wouldn't be testing the processor, we'd be testing the platform. So I want to give this a run on a cheaper motherboard to see whether it does exactly the same job and you just get fewer features for a lot less money, or what. The other thing is that just the other day AMD told us about the A620 chipset. So they have an X670E, X670, B650E, B650 and now the A620. The specification of the A620 is not exciting. In fact, it's cut to the bone. Forget, for example, PCI Express Gen 5. However, the price is absolutely rock bottom. They're saying you better get motherboards starting at $85. Now, as soon as they told us that, they immediately said actually more like 100, and that's a starting point. But the idea that you'll be able to get motherboards that are relatively basic starting at $100, and when you look at the specification of the different chipsets and what you get with the A620, I mean, it just about does what you need for a gaming PC. And that could drop the platform cost for AM5 hugely. And I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if the first time I see an A620 chipset motherboard is when I review a budget PC from the likes of PC Specialist rather than doing a dedicated motherboard review. Even so, I'll be fascinated to see whether this processor works correctly and delivers that same stonking gaming performance on a really cheap motherboard. If it does, that could change my thinking about this processor. So right now I'm leaning towards 9 out of 10 and a must-have, but the pricing of processors at the moment is hugely dynamic, and $479 for this, if that is the correct price, does seem a bit on the steep side, but there's no arguing with the performance, which is quite mind-blowing.